Hope everybody's having a fine week. So we are going to be picking up, finishing off chapter 11, right? So we just had a fun discussion and, went and looked at the different unemployment rates, and we could do a very similar thing with the inflation rates if we wanted, but for the sake of time, I'm going to pass on that. But we have talked about, actually, did we talk about, where did we leave? Sorry, we did jump to chapter 12, right? I skipped, we just went over some questions on chapter 11. So let's go ahead and just jump right into chapter 12. And we can kind of backtrack a little bit when we talk about cost push and demand pull inflation, right? That's what we were going to pick up in class today. So chapter 12, right? So this is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And so what is this doing? Well, essentially it's helping us analyze changes in real GDP. So that's on the x-axis. And how that relates to what? What have we had on the y-axis up until now? We've had prices of individual, goods or industries or whatever, right? And so now we're going to talk about price level. So, building off of that, inflation and talking about how, the prices of goods every year increases and that there's a desirable amount of inflation, right? And so instead of talking about individual prices, we're going to be talking about just in general the price level, right? So you'll often see this abbreviated as PL on the y-axis. So why do we care about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? It gives us a little bit of insight on inflation, unemployment, and economic growth, right? And at the end of the day, economic growth, that's the key thing, right? It doesn't matter, if you've got your inflation and unemployment under control, if you're not actually growing. Now, oftentimes you won't have your inflation and unemployment under control if you're not growing, right? So these things, kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time. So our aggregate demand curve, right? Doesn't matter if it's going to be our individual demand or our aggregate demand. We know that our demand curve is always downward sloping, right? They both start with D. So we're going to have price level on the y-axis. We'll have real GDP on the x-axis. And we're going to have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, just like in figure 12.1. And it's bowed out a little bit, so I didn't do a very good job there. Boop. But it doesn't really matter. It can be straight, it can be bowed out. Technically, it's bowed out. Try and do a better job the next thing. All right, so what are some of the things that could shift the aggregate demand to the, let's talk about to the left first, right? So what are some of the things that are going to shift this aggregate demand? So if this is aggregate demand 0, we'll say this is aggregate demand L for left. So what are some of the things that are going to shift it to the left? Business taxes. Business taxes, right? Business and personal taxes, right? We can kind of lump those together. So let's do it over here, I guess. We'll have an increase in taxes. That's going to shift it down or to the left. What other things? Decreasing income, right? So instead of talking about necessarily, so they don't necessarily define it as income that's the determinant so much as what's the other thing. So the income is a flow. I talk about this a lot, right? Economics confusion of stocks and flows. The income is the flow that goes into what? When you don't spend all your income every year, you end up saving some of it, right? And so it's really the wealth, not necessarily the income, right? So we'll say a decrease in wealth. Because what happens if there's a decrease in your income but you have a bunch of savings? Your spending's probably not going to change all that much, right? There's a lot of spending. We don't really have it's not optional. You know what I mean? Like we have to buy food every day. We have to have shelter. Well, I guess we don't have to, but it's really shitty to live outside. We have to have power and heat and electricity, right? All that kind of stuff. So wealth more so than income. What's kind of the flip side of wealth? So what happens if I spend more than I earn every year? You're in debt, right? And so what happens if there's an increase in household indebtedness? That's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left as well. And then the last one, probably the trickiest one, since, we're not, it's not the last one. It's the last one that's part of so this is kind of the consumption bundle of things that impact this, right? Now, what are the other bundles going to be, right? So essentially, what's aggregate demand? It's C plus I plus G plus NX. So there's going to be some stuff in each category, unfortunately. This is the most extensive category. Yeah, Ruth.
So like government spending.
Yeah, so if all of a sudden we cut government spending by half, if we decrease basing our military abroad, then the aggregate demand would shift in. So again, another reason why cuts in the military aren't necessarily palatable, because it could cause recession. Especially with my research, I do a lot of studies on like the spillover effects. And so like when they close bases, the towns around those bases shrivel and die. So like the bases, in the same way that Chadron State is a center of economic activity for this town, right? If Chadron State closed, you think all these coffee shops will be able to stay open? Hell no, right? It becomes a sleepy town. It becomes someplace where people just go to a bedroom community, right? Where people go to sleep and there's not that many restaurants, so they go and work other places. So the last one, probably the trickiest one, is going to be expectations, right? Expectations. So what are we talking about with expectations here? Why would the demand decrease based on expectations? What's the thinking? What's the reasoning here?
Expectation of the price is changing, so like if it's going to get more expensive later, you buy more.
Or vice versa, if it's going to get way cheaper later, you buy less now. Or if you expect to be laid off in the future, you're going to buy less now, right? If you expect the stock market to take a dive, you're going to buy less now. So how do we actually get a decent measure on these expectations, right? Well, there's an entity called the College Board, and they have some economists. Consumer Sentiment Index. Oh wait, it's not College Board. Conference Board. College Board is in charge of the ACT and the SAT and crap, right? So the Conference Board collects data on consumer confidence. So it's the prevailing business conditions and likely developments. And we just got some recent data at the end of September, right? That said that it decreased following a decline in August. So it's now at 121.5, where 1985 is what they arbitrarily chose as the base year. So everything is, so they ask all these surveys and then, they kind of have to have it out of something or have to have it linked to something. So they just said, well, whatever value this survey was in 1985, that's 100. And so if it gets bigger than 100, that means that consumers are more confident than they were in 1985. And if it gets less, then they were less confident, right? So we see that it's down 9 points from 134.2. There's another index, the Present Situation Index, which is the consumer's assessment of current business and labor market conditions. That decreased 7 points from 176 to 169. And our Expectation Index, looking at our short-term outlook for income, business, and labor market conditions, declined from 106 to 95.8, right? So we see consumer confidence is down by 9.1%. So just 9.1 points. These are in percents. So right now, consumer confidence is low, so we would expect that aggregate demand would shift to the left. Why consumer confidence is low is a question for a whole nother class. All right, so what about investment spending? Investment spending, right? So we've got this I part here. So what's going to impact this I part? It's going to be, so for this one, because we're talking about a decrease, so we'll say it's going to be an increase in the interest rates. Why is there a decrease in investment when there's an increase in the interest rates? Yeah, a lot of times you have to borrow the money in order to invest in large capital projects, right? And so what is your boss, or what are you going to look at if you're the stakeholder, if you're the decision maker? What are you going to look at in terms of, like, should I borrow this money to invest in this project? Well, you're going to look at something called the return on the investment, right? And so you're going to say, well, is my return on the investment more than my cost of capital? If it's not, then I'm not going to invest. So, ceteris paribus, all else equal, if the interest rates are lower, you're going to invest more, just because more projects are palatable in terms of it's going to cost you less to undertake this project. So a project that, say, doesn't necessarily look profitable in the current interest rate environment, if we cut interest rates to near zero, all of a sudden that project does look good. So the interest rate is one, usually kind of an input cost into whatever investment you're making, but also, what else is it? What's another economic concept that we can use to discuss why an increase in the interest rate could have a negative impact on the aggregate demand? And just saying that sentence bores me. Starts with an O. It's 2 words. Opportunity costs, right? So if the interest rates are really high, are you going to go invest and take a risk on something that might not work, that people might not buy? No, you'll just invest it, right? It just makes more sense for you to just invest it in the market, and that, remember that, contrary to how we all use investing and stuff, that is not investment in terms of GDP, right? It's not building anything. It's not expanding anything, right? So if you're just out there buying stocks and bonds, that's not investment, okay? All right. What about, so the next one kind of leads into this a little bit. I mean, it's similar reasons, is expected returns. So this is, what's my expectation for the future? It has to do with, my current technology, where my technology is going, right? Has to do with how much excess capacity I might have right now. What do I mean by excess capacity? Yeah, exactly. So, it could just be land that I'm not using. It could be part of the factory I'm not using. I mean, it could be machines that I'm not using. You know what I mean? Or people that are part-time that I know would like a full-time job, and they don't have any other part-time jobs, right? That's technically excess capacity. And then the last one, we touched upon this at the beginning of class today, business taxes, right? So if you expect business taxes to get worse, if you expect the next administration or Congress or whatever to jack taxes up, then you're going to be investing less, and so that's going to be a decrease in the aggregate demand curve, shift left in the aggregate demand curve. So the next one, changes in government spending, right? That's actually pretty straightforward. It's just going to be plus or minus based on what the government does, right? So plus or minus changes in G. So that just directly flows into the aggregate demand equation and the aggregate demand curve. And then the last one is, and so this is probably one of the trickier ones, and again, this is because we're not used to thinking about exports and stuff, but it's also because, So remember when we first started talking about demand and supply, and we started talking about the shifters or the factors that change the demand and supply, right? And I taught you guys the phrase ceteris paribus, right? All else equal. And one of the main things that we were holding equal was the price of the good, right? We were saying, well, what happens if there's an increase in income, but the price of the good stays the same? That shifts the demand over. What happens if there's a increase in the number of people in the market? If all of a sudden, you know, the population of Chadron triples, what's going to happen to the demand of coffee? It's going to go out, right? Irrespective of the price level, we're holding the price of a cup of coffee or a latte constant, okay? So this is the similar kind of thing. We are looking at any changes in net exports that are, and this is very important, unrelated to the price level. So a lot of times, changes in the net exports are going to be related to the price level. But that is already baked into the aggregate demand curve, right? As the price level decreases, demand increases. So sorry, let's not think about this. It's already baked into this curve, right? As the price level decreases, demand increases. It goes from this to this. And so the demand curve already has that relationship with the price level and the quantity demanded baked into it, right? So we have to look at any changes that are unrelated to the price level. Okay, so what could these be? There's really two that we are going to talk about. And so the first one is the change in national income abroad. So what is going on right now in terms of the world, right? Well, essentially we're seeing this kind of global slowdown. A lot of countries in the world are, you know, experiencing very tepid growth or even negative growth. You guys know what I mean by tepid? It's like, it's lukewarm. It's not that good. It's low. You know, there's the Brexit thing, right? So that's having a drag on the UK economy. That's creating uncertainty for the Eurozone. Germany looks like is about to enter a recession. Greece hasn't recovered from the shit that went down, you know, 5 years ago, you know, so China, because of the trade wars and everything, seems like they're starting to slow down a little bit, so on and so forth, right? So what would we expect to be the shift in aggregate demand? With the current market conditions, we'd expect there to be a decrease in aggregate demand, right? Because we're seeing national income abroad weaken. Does that make sense, everybody? Why does this impact our economy? Because remember, we looked at the stuff, we sell a bunch of stuff abroad, right? We export a bunch of stuff. Now, we don't export as much as we import. We also looked at that, and we looked at the trade balance, and we've seen how that's just gotten more and more negative since the start of this administration and the trade wars and stuff, even though that was one of the big purported reasons to be waging these trade wars, right, was to balance our trade balance, which, by the way, for the record, it's not really a widely supported belief that it should be balanced, regardless. And then the next one, right? So we got national income abroad, and then the next one is exchange rates. So if the dollar depreciates, what does that mean? That means a foreign consumer pays less in their currency to get the US produced good and so this is all regardless of the price of that good. So this, I would honestly say, this is the hardest conceptual, speed bump in economics, is understanding these exchange rates and how they impact our national economy, right? So these foreign, so let's say, there's some Indian national, right? And they want to buy a US product or a US service. Well, if the dollar depreciates, right? So let's look at, sorry, I need to start there we go. Well, hold on, what if I do that? Aha, sweet. So let's look at rupee US dollar exchange rate. So right now, 1 Indian rupee is 0.014 US dollars, right? And we can also flip this around if we want, and we can say, well, what's 1 US dollar? That's 71.03 rupees, okay? So, but let's go back to the other way that we had it. In terms of 1 Indian rupee is this many dollars. So what happens if 1 Indian rupee starts to be worth more US dollars? It takes less rupees for them to get a US product, right? And so it's a strengthening of the Indian currency and a weakening of our currency, right? And weakening is the depreciation part. And so there's always a flip side. If our currency depreciates, their currency appreciates. Okay? So yeah, and these fluctuate, a lot over time, right? In terms of, the value of 1 rupee, well, I guess it hasn't fluctuated a ton. At one point, it was almost 3 cents. Now it's down to 1 cent. And so at this point, right, when a rupee bought 2.5 cents, bought twice as much dollars as it does right now, it was much cheaper for them to import US goods and services than it currently is. So why do you think they, it looks like they, and they have been, the Royal Bank of India or whatever, the Central Bank of India, they've been trying to keep their exchange rate relatively low, right? And it's for the same reasons that I said right here, right? If the currency depreciates, then foreign consumers, US, will be buying more Indian services, right? That's why when you call your phone company or call your power company or whatever, oftentimes you'll be sent to a call center in India because it's cheap. So a lot of the reason why labor does not have a lot of bargaining power and unions are not necessarily as important or as influential as they once were in the United States is because information technology has made the world much smaller, right? It's much easier now to manage something across an ocean. And it's also much easier to, switch the calls, and have them just go to this Indian call center, right? As opposed to, 50 years ago, there was friggin' switchboards and there were people that, pulled out stuff and put, you know what I mean? So it wasn't really possible. And international calls were really expensive and so on and so forth, right? So the internet has really, miniaturized the business world in such a way that it's much, much easier to offshore because the exchange rate's usually in your favor. The labor costs are usually less, right? Indian workers, let's see what the average Indian worker makes. $616 annually. Damn. That ain't much. $2 per hour, factory worker. So makes a lot of sense. If you want to produce goods very cheaply, have the most profit in terms of your goods, why would you pay the minimum wage of the United States worker when you could pay, these foreign workers who, have lower expectations in terms of their pay? And then oftentimes, the exchange rate movements will, help you out in terms of you can get them even cheaper than they are. Now, some people call this kind of practice very exploitative, in terms of we are, taking advantage of these developing and emerging countries. We're using them for these low value added parts of our supply chain, and it's not actually improving the quality of life of the workers and things like that, right? So that's one argument. And then the other argument, which you'll hear espoused by a lot of, or not espoused, because that means you don't like it, expounded by a lot of libertarians, in terms of, well, it's better that they have some job than none. So they'll kind of defend child labor and, the factories in China that make all of our iPhones that have suicide netting on the buildings so that you can't jump and kill yourself. They have netting to catch you because, a dead worker doesn't make anything, right? So they got to keep you alive. But that's how miserable the factories are. But people are like, well, that's better than nothing, right? So it's an ongoing debate. I wish it was debated more. A lot of people experience what we call, or what Marx calls, right? What Karl Marx, which I'm sure all of you guys think is a villain because the US culture has done a great job of villainizing him. But he was one of the most brilliant minds in economics in terms of just laying things out in a very clear and novel way. And he talked about how we are all alienated from the commodities. So back in the day, you used to know the person that made your shoes. You used to know the butcher. You used to know all this other kind of stuff. Right now, you go to the store and you buy some wrapped up piece of meat. You have no idea where it came from, the working conditions of the person that made it, right? And you just don't care. Like, why do you guys choose the clothing that you choose? Because it was cheap and it fit. Not because you looked into the labor standards and you made sure that there were no slaves producing your garments. Slaves produce almost all our garments. They're not slaves, but they're slaves. And so we have such a discontinuity, right? A dissonance between, understanding or even being aware of the labor market conditions. So for instance, I know, another one of my great rants. You guys probably don't know about this, but it happened not too long ago. It was a garment factory. It collapsed in 2013. Let's see, New York Times, that seems fine. Let's take a 5-minute depressing break and reflect on how we don't give a shit on where our clothes are from.
I started the day normally like other days. Immediately I take my camera and get I suddenly felt, am I in a war zone?
So they had fake fire doors that didn't work?
From the rubble. Someone saying, chop off my leg and pull me out.
They had fake sprinklers?
I stopped shooting. I was trying to help around 7:30. Two volunteer worker called me and showed me the dead bodies under the rubble. I saw the bodies kind of huddle each other, holding each other to survive. I started shooting again. I felt like these images should be the voice of these people who died. No one knows their story, how they survived making these clothes for first world countries. there's no question the contribution of government industry in Bangladesh, the economy, but it needs more good rules and regulation. I see the brand name all the time. The tags remind me the tags I've seen in Rana Plaza collapse. People don't want to pay more. If you don't want to pay more, how the producer would pay more to the workers? So it's like the chain, start from the consumer and ends to the labor. Still a lot of people are missing. They didn't find their bodies. Somebody lost two daughters, two sons, husband, wife, both. Who will take their responsibility?
And very little has changed. There was a campaign, and so there was a trust fund, and but at the end of the day, the labor market conditions are still really, really crappy. So the really tragic thing about that was that it could have been entirely prevented. Like, it didn't need to be 1,000 people that died. The factory owner literally just cut costs by making fire doors that didn't open. And so these people, there was a fire broke out, and they couldn't do anything. Very shit. Yay, capitalism. It really bums me out too. All right, moving on. So, what about the aggregate supply, right? So the aggregate supply, there's really no way to segue from that. So our aggregate supply curve, right? This is telling us what level of output is available at each possible price level. So our supply curve is kind of annoying in this chapter because we have 3 supply curves. It's not just one. I know. Good fun, right? So let's go ahead and get into it. So this is going to be A. This is our aggregate supply immediate short run. And in the immediate case, we can't actually, so in the medium case, the prices we assume do not change. Or sorry, in the immediate, not mediate. There's rigidity in prices. And so this is our ASISR. And so if there's any corresponding changes in aggregate demand, they're just going to have an impact on the production, not on the price level at all, right? So why do we assume that these prices are fixed? Zoom time. So the book says 75% of our average firm's costs are wages and salaries, right? And those are almost always fixed by labor contracts or something else. And if you don't have labor contracts, then it's essentially downwardly inflexible because you can't pay less than minimum wage, right? So you've got a lot of minimum wage workers or something like that. So that's why we assume that the input prices are fixed for a much longer duration than output prices, which is why it's so sticky. Okay, now let's move on to the interesting aggregate supply curve, figure 12.4 on page 301, AS short run. And so this is figure 12.4 on page 301. And this one is going to be upward sloping and it's going to be convex. So it's increasing at an increasing rate. So I talked about the demand curve and how that bowed out and it wasn't important. Still true. This one needs to bow out though. There's a couple reasons. So we're going to talk about that. Why is it convex? So, you know, the slope of it is increasing at an increasing rate, right? If we were to, you know, get the slope of this right down here, maybe the slope would be only, you know, 1, right? But then the slope here is going to be way more than 1, right? The slope increases to, you know, 3, a rise of 3 over a run of 1, right? Everybody with me there? So the slope is increasing. So it's a positive slope that's increasing, which means it's convex. You won't need to know that, but just for the math nerds out there. Okay. So why is it upward sloping and curved like this? Well, there is a very important point on this graph that we call the full employment quantity. So we all learned about full employment in chapter 11, right? It is this fantastical idea. I don't actually really believe in the natural adjusted inflation rate of unemployment, which is what it's referring to. But it's the notion that essentially, you know, there's some amount of employment where we're fully employed, where our resources are utilized as efficiently as they can be. So remember, we talked about the 3 types of unemployment: structural, frictional, and cyclical. So this would essentially be saying that we're only experiencing some frictional and maybe a little bit of the other ones, but like a normal amount of it is what it's saying. And so to the left of this unemployment output curve, it's relatively flat, right? So we'll say when Q is less than QF, the slope is flat. And this is to reflect the relative abundance of idle inputs. So what does that mean? Therefore, firms can increase production, QI, right, without increasing their costs too much. When our quantity is greater than our full employment, what's it called? The full employment output. Then there's a shortage of idle inputs, right? And so that means to increase quantity, you end up having to increase costs a lot. Sorry, questions on that? So for the remainder of the chapter and really the book, this is the curve we're talking about when we talk about the aggregate supply function. So if there's no caveat to it, they're talking about this. This is the general aggregate supply that we're going to be using for all of our analysis and stuff. All right, so I told you that aggregate supply was annoying because there's 3 forms. We've only talked about 2 of them. So you know what's coming. C, aggregate supply in the long run. In the long run. So who can guess if it started out horizontal and it went with a positive slope? You just take it to the nth degree, right? And you end up with a completely vertical aggregate supply long run. And so why is it vertical in the long run? Because in the long run, we assume that it's the resource prices that adjust to the price level, not the other way around. And so what does this mean? There's no incentive for firms to change their output. And I mean, an underlying part of this has to do with this right here, right? Essentially, like in the long run, you can't push past this limit of real GDP. There's only so much land, there's only so much oil, there's only so many people, right? It's finite. At the end of the day, what is economics? It's the allocation of scarce resources, right? And so, you know, finiteness is a crucial element of that. What would be the case, or what would happen if we didn't have this finite constraint and stuff, right? Well, essentially, almost all of economics would be tossed out. So we would be living in what's called a post-scarcity world. You guys probably never watched the show, but Star Trek is a classic sci-fi show that it was post-scarcity. It was they didn't have resource constraints in the same way, right? Because they had these replicators that could essentially make anything. And I think they had like giant replicators to make other replicators, and so it was all just kind of taken care of in a way. So, if the planet survives long enough for us to get to post-scarcity, or if we end up, colonizing asteroids or other planets or other moons or something like that, right? There's actually a really interesting, I think it's a paper or something, but it essentially says that the first person to mine an asteroid, because there's so much like gold and rare earth minerals and all sorts of crazy stuff on these asteroids, the first person or company or country to successfully mine an asteroid will like be instantly the richest person in the world, like by an order of 10 times, because it's just so much stuff.
Wouldn't that break our system, though?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it depends on what they do with it. You know what I mean? I mean, like we always have a richest person in the world. Right now, who is it? It's Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon. He's the richest person in the world. I mean, so there's always going to be a richest person in the world, but it's essentially how do they reintroduce that surplus of, you know, resources and therefore into the system, right? You know, and so I mean, the main thing would be that it would cause, what would it cause? It would cause deflation. So there'd be way more stuff and the same amount of money, right? And so think about it, when there's the same amount of stuff and we increase the amount of money, there's inflation, right? Because each piece of money is then worth less stuff. But if all of a sudden there's all this stuff that gets piled on and we don't increase the money supply, then the cost of everything is going to go down. And so we'd experience some crazy deflation, which is just as bad as inflation. Okay, good questions. So, all right, what are the determinants of our aggregate supply? And again, I'm going to be talking about the short run aggregate supply, right? So, or not, yeah, the short run, so number B. Determinant of aggregate supply. I'm going to get some paper. Okay. So, you know, just like in the micro, right? Because again, we're entering the macro world with this chapter. So just like when we talked about individual firms or industries, any sort of change in the input prices, right? And this could be because of, you know, domestic resource prices. Focus, man, focus. This could be because of the imported resource prices. So what is the main imported resource historically for the United States? Oil, right? Oil, crude oil, gas. And then lastly, what is the last one that's going to impact our input prices? It's kind of related to B. The trickiest subject known to econ freshman students. Exchange rate fluctuations, right? Exchange rate. There's a hyphen there. What else is going to impact the aggregate supply curve, right? Any sort of changes in productivity. If the productivity increases, our unit production costs are going to fall. And so as a result, the aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So here, if we have an increase in productivity, and that means we've got a decrease in per unit production prices. And this is going to cause a shift rightwards in the aggregate supply curve. So how do we know it's a shift rightward, right? So let's go ahead and draw it out. Price level, real GDP, super bowed out curve. So would I imagine, so this is the way that I do it, because aggregate supply is always trickier than aggregate demand. And part of the reason is because some students think that an increase in the aggregate supply means that this aggregate supply curve goes up. No, that's why I want you guys to think about rightward and leftward shifts. A rightward shift is always positive. A leftward shift is always negative. So an up, right, which is the same as a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve, is for a decrease. And so this is the way, so if you're on a test or something like that, or on a quiz and you're kind of stumped, right? What I like to do, I like to hold the price level constant. Bloop. And I like to say, okay, if there's an increase in the productivity, do I imagine that at a constant price level, there's going to be less or more stuff produced? If there's an increase in the productivity and there's no increase or decrease in anything else, then we expect that there's going to be more stuff produced, right? And so as a result, I shift my aggregate supply curve out. Does that make sense to everybody? So if you ever get tripped up on the supply curve, whether it's aggregate or regular supply curve, hold that y-axis, hold that price or price level constant, and ask yourself, given your intuition, if productivity increases or if inputs become cheaper, do I expect them to produce more or less at that given price level? And the answer will usually be fairly clear. And the last one is our changes in the legal institutional environment. So this is where, business taxes and, government regulation or the lack of government regulation comes into play. So if there's an increase in the business tax, that's going to shift the aggregate supply to the left. Why? Because, for any given price level, they're going to be producing less now because they've got to give some more to Uncle Scam, right? And the same thing with the government regulation. As there's more government regulation, and that means that there's going to be more of your input costs devoted to meeting those regulations. Sometimes there's like a person where that's their whole job is compliance with regulations, right? So you have to hire, a $60,000 a year, $80,000 a year, quasi lawyer to help you with all this stuff. And so it's gonna drag on what you can actually produce and sell to the public. Any questions on aggregate supply shifters, aggregate demand shifters? These are going to be, you know how we use those supply and demand shifters quite a lot? This is a similar kind of thing. We're going to be using these aggregate demand, aggregate supply shifters for the next couple of chapters. So if you're having trouble on them, I highly suggest, come to me to office hours, look on Khan Academy. He details, how they're derived and how they move and everything like that. And then also there's a great, in fact, let's just take a quick little video break since I'm really boring myself today. Oh yeah, it's crazy. And then Zimbabwe too. Yeah, these are the two craziest examples of hyperinflation. Let's see what this has got. Venezuela had some crazy hyperinflation too. And that, honestly, this hyperinflation and the fact that, everybody thinks that, they're safe from it or whatever, is part of the reason why I am a kind of a believer in cryptocurrency and things like that, right? Because when this was happening in Venezuela, think of how amazing it would have been to have a Bitcoin, instead of having to deal with these inflations, right? So I'm trying to think. So wheelbarrow inflation, reminiscent of Germany, right? So yeah, between 1918 and 1923, the German mark deteriorated. The people were actually seen pushing wheelbarrows of rapidly depreciating paper marks to pay their bills as quickly as possible. So you would get paid and you would run with your wheelbarrows of money to go and pay your gas or whatever to buy bread, because the price of bread would increase like every hour. And so why did they do that? Well, essentially, they were moving off the gold standard. They were paying for repatriations of war. They weren't really coming to grips with the problems of the company. And so this is part of the reason why we want an independent central bank, right? And honestly, it's part of the reason why Trump's bullying of the central bank chair is really kind of troubling. Because if we have a central bank that just reacts to whatever the public or whatever the politicians want, or whatever, then this is what we get. We get hyperinflation, right? Because they're doing stuff to not necessarily for the good of the country in the long run. They're doing stuff to shore up political support so that they can be reelected in the next cycle. And so oftentimes, especially with monetary phenomenon, any kind of short-term benefit has a really nasty long-term hangover. And so that's what they saw with Germany and the hyperinflation. So $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. And it shifted to a barter economy, right? Where people were trading art and jewels and fine wines for staples like milk and bread. Honestly, wine is one of the greatest kind of stores of value. Even if you don't like wine, Like having some wine, like, you know, wine and bullets, I think are probably some of the greatest, you know, emergency cases. Way better than gold. You know, you can't drink gold, you know, and if it's the end of the world, of course you're going to want to get drunk, right? And so people are buying these expensive wines and trading for milk and bread and stuff. So in Zimbabwe, again, they had a costly involvement with a conflict. Peak hyperinflation was 231 million%. So they defaulted on their debt. They suspended its currency, and they used the U.S. dollar. So U.S. dollar is the legal currency in Zimbabwe. So pretty crazy stuff. All right. So supply and demand. So this guy, Mr. Clifford, he does these awesome videos, and one of the ones I really like are his econ movies, where he breaks down different movies and talks about the economic concepts within the movies. So this is his 7-minute clip on Indiana Jones.
Hey, how you doing, students? This is Mr. Clifford. Welcome to Econ Movies. Today we're going to look at the economics in Indiana Jones.
Great classic movie if y'all never seen it. Don't watch the latest one.
Dr. Jones isn't an economist. He's an archaeologist.
We do not follow maps. X never, ever marks the spot.
Sounds pretty boring. Let's look at one of the most important concepts in all of economics, demand and supply.
He needs a better
It
mic.
all starts with buyers and sellers.
You believe me, little answer.
They come together to negotiate a price that works for both. The buyer wants to pay the lowest price possible, but the seller doesn't have to accept that offer.
The diamond law. The deal is for the diamond.
Now, if the buyer really wants that product, he's going to have to increase the price to something that the seller is willing to take. In this example, there's just one
Great acting
buyer
there.
and one seller.
Fantastic.
When you start analyzing multiple buyers and sellers, then you're looking at markets. To understand markets, Indiana Jones needs to find somebody to teach him demand and supply. To learn about demand and supply, let's pick a market that we can analyze. So let's pick something like pet snakes.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Let's start with demand. To have demand, buyers must be willing and able to buy pet snakes. Now, obviously, some people like pet snakes and some people don't. When the price is really high, let's say $100 for a pet snake, people don't want to buy very many snakes. In this case,
So you get the
only
point.
10 would be purchased.
He's boring me too. Maybe I'm just having a low attention span day. All right, moving on. But he's great. He's got great videos. They're not all movie oriented, right? Some of them are just explanation videos. So I highly recommend utilizing all of the different resources at your disposal if you're having any sort of conceptual difficulty with these concepts. All right, moving right along. So I told you guys that we would be talking about cost push and demand pull inflation, and so that's what we're going to be getting into now. So just like in the individual supply and demand, right, we have an equilibrium. And so there's an equilibrium price and quantity where AD meet aggregate supply. And so now let's go ahead and talk about demand pull inflation. So if we are in a situation we've got a upward sloping aggregate supply curve. We've got a downward sloping aggregate demand curve, right? And here is our equilibrium. Gesundheit. And what happens if there is what we call demand pull inflation, right? So demand pull inflation talks about the fact that any significant increase in the aggregate demand, the resulting new equilibrium is going to have a higher price level, right? And what's the higher price level signify? More inflation. So that's all this is really talking about. We've had a lot of episodes of demand pull inflation. You know, I'm not even gonna write the dates down. I don't care, you don't need that. So what happens if this demand pull inflation exceeds the full employment output, right? So what if the full employment output was right here? What would we call this new, or what would we call this? So let's say, what would we call this gap right here? Anybody recall? So it's an inflationary GDP gap. Why is it inflationary? Because if we don't do anything, if we just let this occur, then the price levels are going to increase, right? And we're going to get higher price levels than, you know, we necessarily want. Again, rising price levels are, you know, natural, but if they rise by too much, then, you know, that would suck. Like, you know, because our wages oftentimes don't keep up with the increase in the prices, right? There's a lag between the impact that the price increases have on the wages that we earn. And so, you know, it would kind of suck tomorrow if we went into Walmart and everything that we bought, you know, all the frozen dinners and crap, because I live like a bachelor, you know, are $4 now instead of $2.50. You know, that would suck. That'd be less that I could eat for any given month or whatever, or I'd have to start cooking or something horrible. So that's an inflationary gap. Questions on that? It sounds more confusing than it actually is. You know, it sounds all hard, but it's not.
So the demand pull is inflation because the equilibrium price is.
Yes, the equilibrium price is higher in terms of the y-axis. So that's why this is demand pull inflation. There's really two types of inflation we're going to talk about. So there's demand pull inflation, and then the next one is the cost push inflation. So if we have no questions on that, we'll move on to C, cost push inflation. And so this is, what do they have? They've got page 310, figure 2.9. You can see that? 310, figure 12.9. 2. Price level, R GDP. And we're going to have a aggregate demand curve, upward sloping supply one curve. Okay, so when there's a leftward shift in the aggregate supply curve, then we go from a first equilibrium price level to a higher equilibrium price level, right? So PL star to PL double star. So this one, we should remember that the biggest example of cost push inflation is the oil shocks that happened in the mid to late 1970s. So we had some crazy inflation in the late 1970s, and then the Federal Reserve, in order to get that inflation under control, they jacked up the interest rates a lot, right? And that's why in the 1980s, like savings accounts paid like 12%. How awesome would that be if every year your savings account paid 12%, right? You know, our whole lifetime, savings accounts have paid nothing, like less than 1%. So, but that's a reflection of the current monetary conditions. All right. Why have recent increases in oil prices had less of an impact? So remember when we looked at the composition of our exports and our imports? And remember, you know, there was a great question about, well, let's look at it over time and see if our reliance on imports of oil has decreased over time. And we did see that it decreased. It used to be 15% of our imports, and now it's only 7%, right? So oil's importance in the US economy and also our foreign reliance of it has decreased. So it's a combination effect. Like oil used to be 10% of our GDP, now it's only 3%. And it's also the fact that we produce a lot of our own oil, and so we're not as susceptible to international price spikes. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay.
Does this also count as inflationary?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, wait, no, sorry. No. As a gap? No, because, and this all depends on where you put the full employment quantity. You know what I mean? So I'm just arbitrarily putting it right here. You would be given full employment in a test prompt or whatever, or, you know, in reality, I think there are some people out there that estimate this, but don't hold me to that. And so if the GDP falls below the full employment output, then that's going to be what we call an expansionary gap. And part of the reason for that is that means that, like, we have room to grow, we have room to expand, right? We can do certain things to close that gap. And that's actually what the next chapter details in terms of, you know, what can the government do? What does the government do to mess with this, to alter, to manipulate it, so that, you know, say we're at a point where we're below the full employment output, how can they expand the economy such that our new equilibrium is at that full employment output? Because again, remember, our central bank here in the United States, it's very unique in that it has two mandates, right? Not just to keep prices and inflation constant, right? That's the mandate of every central bank around the world. Because you don't want to be Zimbabwe, you don't want to be Germany, you don't want to have the prices changing every hour, right? Just think of how much productivity lost and the worry that you would have and everything like that, right? Like, how would we produce as much stuff if you're spending time running to go pay all your bills, and if you're worried about, you know, am I getting wage increases that are corresponding to the increase in the price of bread and stuff like that? So this is just telling us that we have room to grow. All right. So, got about 5 minutes left. Let's talk about downward wage and flexibility and the ratchet effect, and then we will stop there for the day. So, downward, oh, you guys can see. So, one of the biggest things is that, you know, everyone's afraid, fear of price wars keep prices from being reduced. Other thing is what's called menu costs. What are menu costs?
If you lower prices, it creates other costs, like the menu's an example. Like if you change all your prices, you have to
print new menus, yeah. So it costs money, right? Just literally, you know, and that's part of the reason why, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but you know, McDonald's and Burger King and everything now, they have digital displays. And part of that is so that they can more flexibly adjust the prices, and they don't need to, you know, reprint and reship and everything, you know, the new displays to people. They can just whoop, through the computer. What else is going on? If wage contracts, right? We know that wage contracts are not flexible. So inflexible wage contracts. So, you know, you usually hire somebody for a year at a certain wage, or, you know, and then they have reviews and stuff like that, right? But it's not necessarily like, well, if stuff goes south, then we're going to be able to pay you less, right? Like nobody agrees to that in their contract. And then what's the other thing? Even if there's no contract that makes the wages inflexible, right? Do you think that employers are you know, like gung-ho to actually cut wages, right? So what are some of the reasons why they might be reluctant to cut wages? I mean, the biggest one is, you know, employee effort, right? Employee effort is going to go down the tubes. And so most of, one of the best theories. Okay, so quick tangent. What you are all taught, for the most part, is that you get as a wage the exact value of the marginal product of your labor. So essentially, like, if your marginal product of labor is, you know, 2 in terms of you increase, so your MPL is equal to 2, meaning that every hour that you work, you produce 2, whatever, guns, dog houses, I don't care, right? And then let's say that the value of it, let's say that the price of those things are $8. Then you put them together, your wage should be 2 times 8, $16 an hour. So this is like the most simplistic breakdown of why we get paid what we get paid, right? However, what in reality happens, so this is, you know, kind of theory. And the reality of the situation is that firms, yes, go for it. Firms pay a efficiency wage. So what does that mean? They're trying to maximize work effort and productivity and minimize costs, including what? Overseeing, right? Costs, and this includes, you know, oversight. So the theory goes, if you pay somebody more than they know that they're worth, then you don't necessarily need to be over their shoulder and watching their actions every time, because that person knows that they're getting a really good wage compared to what they would get elsewhere, and so they're going to work really hard to keep that wage. Does that kind of make sense? So these are the 2 ways that we can think about wages. So the last one, and I apologize for keeping you late, minimum wages keep wages from falling, right? And so this all comes together with what's called the ratchet effect. And this is where we'll stop today. The ratchet effect says that price level changes are asymmetrical. What does that mean? They rise more easily than they fall. So, you know, just like a ratchet, if you use a ratchet instead of a wrench, right, it only really turns one way, and then you can, you know, keep going. So you're constantly turning in the right and the correct way. And this is talking about how prices are very similar to that, right? And so as proof of this, since 1950, the US price level has fallen only twice. And that was in 1955 and 2009. 2009 was because of the great financial crisis, right? The Great Recession. 1955, I honestly don't know. So if anybody wants to look into that and get back to me, I will give you some extra credit. All right, that's all I got for you today. Have an awesome weekend. Go see our awesome classmate in the Evil Dead show, right? So go support your classmate. I'm going to be going tomorrow. And I'll see you all on Tuesday. Last week of class next week. Woo! Does anybody want my notes? I just like throw them away at the end of the class anyway. So.
What do you mean by the price level drops?
There's deflation.
Just, yeah, in general, like prices.
Yeah, so prices, so last year, you know, it cost me $3 for bread and $700 for rent, and this year it cost me $2.85 for bread and $650 for rent. So yeah, so it's just talking about the prices of that, you know, full basket of goods changes.